Mr. President, what, if anything, do you propose to do about the continued presence in Cuba of the Soviet military personnel? Are you just going to let them stay there?
Well, as you know, we've been carrying out a good many policies in the last 4 months since October. We were able to effect the withdrawal of the missiles. We were able to effect the withdrawal of the planes. There has been a reduction of 4,500 in the number of personnel. That was done by the United States being willing to move through a very dangerous period and the loss of an American soldier. The continued presence of Soviet military personnel is of concern to us. I think the actions the United States has taken over the last 4 months indicate that we do not view the threat lightly.
Mr. President, Defense Secretary McNamara apparently failed to convince some Republicans that all offensive weapons have withdrawn from Cuba. What more, if anything, do you believe the administration can do to convince some of the critics?
Well, I don't know what more we can do. Mr. McNamara went to great length. As he pointed out, he exposed a good deal of information, and also he went further than under ordinary conditions we would have liked to have gone in telling our story. Now, he has asked, and I endorse, and Mr. McCone has asked, that if anybody has any information in regard to the presence of offensive weapon system, or indeed the presence of any military force or weapons on the island of Cuba, I think they should make it available. General Carroll, who's in charge of intelligence for the Defense Department, if they will turn the information over. Now, we get hundreds of reports every month, and we try to check them out. Many of them are just rumors or reports. And even some of the members of Congress who've come forward either refuse to say where they've heard the information or provide us with reports which do not have substance to them. Now, I cannot carry out the policy of the United States government on the question, if obviously their offensive missiles were found in Cuba, contrary to Mr. Khrushchev's pledge, it would raise the greatest risks, much greater, in my opinion, than we faced in October, and we faced great risks in October. So, but to take the United States into that path, to persuade our allies to come with us, to hazard our allies, as well as the security of the free world, as well as the peace of the free world, we have to move with hard intelligence. We have to know what we're talking about. We cannot base the issue of war and peace on a rumor or report, which is not substantiated, or which some member of Congress refuses to tell us where he heard it. This issue involves very definitely war and peace. And when you talk about the presence of offensive weapons there, if they are there, I think the Soviet Union is aware, and Cuba is aware, that we would be back where we were in October, but in a far more concentrated way. Now, if you're talking about that, and talking about the kinds of actions which would come from that, it seems to me we ought to know what we're talking about. Now, it may be that there are hidden away some missiles. Nobody can prove that they're, in the finite sense, that they're not there, or they might be brought in. But they're going to have to be erected. And we continue complete surveillance. They have to be moved. They have to be put onto pads. They have to be prepared to fire. And quite obviously, if the Soviet Union did that, it would indicate that they were prepared to take the chance of another great encounter between us with all the dangers. Now, they had those missiles on the pads, and they withdrew them. So the United States is not powerless in the area of Cuba. But I do think we should keep our heads and attempt to use the best information we have. We've got, I think as Secretary McNamara demonstrated, we're taking the greatest pains to try to be accurate. But we have to deal with facts as we know them and not merely rumors and speculation. Now, as I say, these things may all come about, and we may find ourselves again with the Soviet Union toe-to-toe. But we ought to know what we have in our hands before we bring the United States and ask our allies to come with us to the brink again.
Yes. Mr. President, what is the administration's position now about the on-site inspections that you were insisting upon in October? Is that now a dead letter?
Yeah, that's right. Cuba did not agree to on-site inspection unless there was inspection of the United States, which we did not agree to. As part of that was the question of the no-invasion pledge and the rest, so that there has been no on-site inspection, and I do not expect to get any. I don't expect that Cuba will agree to the kind of on-site inspection that would give us more assurances than we have at the present time through photography. Yes, Ms. Craig.
Mr. President, because we depend so much on photo reconnaissance, what would be our position if the President of Cuba should forbid that and perhaps take a protest to the United Nations about what you call our daily scrutiny over their territory?
I would think we would deal with that situation when it comes up. This is a substitute, in a sense, for the kind of on-site inspection which we hope to get and which was proposed by the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time of the October crisis. Now, the United States cannot, given the history of the last fall, where deception was used against us, we could not be expected to merely trust to words in regard to a potential buildup, so that we may have to face that situation, but if we do, we'll face it.
Mr. Khrushchev apparently gave you some reason to believe last October that the Soviet military personnel were going to be withdrawn from Cuba. That hasn't happened, and my question is there any official dialogue going on now to find out why the Russians are still there?
Well, as I say, there has been this reduction which we already described. In addition, as Mr. McNamara described yesterday, a picture of some evidence of some equipment being moved out. This is a continuing matter which is being discussed, obviously, with the Soviet government, and we would expect that we would have clearer information as to the prospects as these days go on. But it has not been completed, and quite obviously, in that sense, is unfinished business. Yes,
what chances do you think, or do you believe there are of eliminating communism in Cuba within your term?
We couldn't make any prediction about the elimination. We're quite obviously hopeful that it can be eliminated, but we have to wait and see what happens. There are a lot of unpleasant situations in the world today. China is one. It's unfortunate that communism was permitted to come into Cuba. It's been a problem since in the last 5 years. We don't know what's going to happen internally. There's no obviously easy solution as to how to dig them, as to how the communist movement will be removed. One way, of course, would be by the Cubans themselves, though that's very difficult given the police setup. The other way would be by external action, but that's war, and we should not regard that as a cheap or easy way to accomplish what we wish. We live with a lot of dangerous situations all over the world. Berlin is one. There are many others, and we live with a good deal of hazard all around the world and have for 15 years. I cannot set down any time in which I can clearly see the end to the Castro regime. I believe it's going to come, but I couldn't possibly give a time limit. I think that those who do sometimes mislead. I remember a good deal of talk in the early 50s about liberation, how Eastern Europe was going to be liberated. And then we had Hungary and Poland and East Germany, and no action was taken. And the reason the action wasn't taken was because they felt strongly that if they did take action, it would bring on another war. So it's quite easy to discuss these things and say one thing or another ought to be done. But when they start talking about how, and when they start talking about Americans invading Cuba and killing thousands of Cubans and Americans with all the hazards around the world, that's a very serious decision, and I notice that that's not approached directly by a good many who discuss the problem.
You have said that the presence of Russian forces on the island are a matter of concern. I'd like to ask this question, sir. Do you think that Cuba is a serious military threat to the United States?
I think we ought to keep a sense of proportion about the size of the force we're talking about. We're talking about 4 groups, which are 1,100 to 1,200 men each. Those are the organized military units. That's about 6,000 men. Obviously, those forces cannot be used to invade another country. They may be used to maintain some sort of control within Cuba, but obviously are not a force that can be used externally. In addition, Cuba cannot possibly. It lacks any amphibious equipment, and it is quite obviously our power in that area is overwhelming. I think the big danger to Latin America, if I may say so, are the very difficult, in some cases desperate conditions in the countries themselves, unrelated to Cuba. Illiteracy or bad housing or maldistribution of wealth or political or social instability. These are all the problems we find a diminishing exchange, balance of payment difficulty, drop in the price of their raw materials upon which their income depends. These are all the problems that I think are staggering, to which we ought to be devoting our attention. Now, I think Castro has been discredited in the past months, substantially. Every one of our surveys and USI show it. One of the reasons has been the missile business and also the presence of Russian forces, which in a sense seem to be police units. So that what I think we should concern ourselves with, quite obviously, is Cuba. But Cuba, as a center of propaganda and possibly subversion, the training of agents, these are the things which we must watch about Cuba. But in the larger sense, it is the desperate, in some cases, internal problems in Latin America themselves, unrelated to Fidel Castro, whose image is greatly tarnished over a year ago, which caused me the concern, and why I regard Latin America as the most critical area in the world today, and why I would hope that Western Europe and the United States would not be so preoccupied with our disputes, which historically may not seem justified, when we have a very, very critical problem which should concern us both in Latin America. Yes.
Now that I got your answer, I think so. The answer is that you do not think that it is a great military threat, but rather a threat in these areas you speak of.
The military threat would come if there was a reintroduction of the offensive weapons. But the kind of forces we're talking about, which are 6,000, do not represent a military threat. Cuba is a threat for the reasons that I have given, but it's a threat, I don't want to give the whole answer again, but it's the threat for the reasons I tried to respond to you.
President, according to the recent remarks of Secretary Rusk, he said Mr. Khrushchev indicated that Soviet troops would be removed from Cuba in due course. Do you feel you have a commitment from Mr. Khrushchev in this regard, and what do you take due course to mean?
That's what we're going to try to find out. That was the statement that was made. As I say, that's why I think in the coming days and weeks we may have a clear idea as to whether that means this winter or not, and that's a matter of great interest to us.
Do you feel you have a commitment, sir, from Mr. Khrushchev?
I have read a statement of Mr. Khrushchev's that these forces would be removed in due course or due time. The time was not stated, and therefore we're trying to get a more satisfactory definition. The problem of the federal government, the national government, what information it puts out, and I think we're trying to give the information on the matter of Cuba. We've been trying to be accurate. And there's also, seems to me, the information of the press to make a judgment as to whether information that is coming out is accurate, not only by the national government, but by others, and to subject that to careful scrutiny as they do our information. Now, I remember a story the other day in one of our prominent papers, which had a report of a congressman about the presence of missiles, no supporting evidence, no willingness to give us the source of his information. We are not, after all, a foreign power. And on page 10 was page 10 was a statement of the Secretary of Defense giving very clear details. That was page 10, the other was page 1. So it's a responsibility of ours, and it seems to me also the press. I would think a good many Americans, after the last 3 weeks of headlines, have the impression that there are offensive weapons in Cuba. Now, it is our judgment, based on the best intelligence we can get, that there are not offensive weapons in Cuba. And I think it's important that the American people have an understanding and not compel, because of these various rumors and speculations, to compel the Secretary of Defense to go on television for 2 hours to try to get the truth to the American people, and in the course of it have to give a good deal of information, which we are rather reluctant to give, about our intelligence gathering facilities.
Mr. President, do you feel that it is possible that the defensive weapons now going into Cuba, or are there now, could be used for offensive purposes? For example, could not a defensive missile be used, launched from a PT boat or some other vessel? And if you do find this to be true, do you feel that any action would be required?
The range of the missiles on the Comar, the 12 Comars, I think, is, I believe, 18 miles. So we would not regard that as a weapon which would be used on attacking the United States. If there's going to be that kind of an attack in the United States, then you're going to have an attack from places other than Cuba, and you're going to have them with much larger weapons than a Comar torpedo boat can carry. Then you're talking about the willingness of the Soviet Union to begin a major war. Now, if the Soviet Union is prepared to begin a major war which will result in hundreds of millions of casualties, and by the time it's finished, then, of course, we face a situation which is extremely grave. I do not believe that that's what the Soviet Union wants, because I think they have other interests. I think they wish to seize power, but I don't think they wish to do so by a war. I therefore doubt if a Comar torpedo boat is going to attack the United States very soon. Now, it's possible. It's possible. It's possible. Everything is possible, and after our experience last fall, we operate on the assumption, while hoping for the best, we expect the worst. It's very possible that the worst will come, and we should prepare for it. That's why we continue our daily surveillance. It's possible, conceivable. We cannot prove that there is not a missile in a cave, or the Soviet Union isn't going to ship next week. We prepare for that. But we will find them when they do, and when they do, the Soviet Union and Cuba and the United States must all be aware that this will produce the greatest crisis which the world has faced in its history. So I think that the Soviet Union will proceed with caution and care, and I think we should.
President, thank you.
Thank you, Helen.